Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's lecture. So this week we're going to talk about sex-positive education and how queer experiences can be integrated into sex ed curriculum and learning in our schools and universities. Now, I know that you all last week watched Sex Ed the movie. I thought this film was a really good description of the history of sex ed in the United States since the post-World War era. Now, you may have noticed that there are several major themes outlined in the film. First, sex education has historically focused on heteronormative and gender binary norms. If you saw in the film interviews with experts and clips from sex ed videos used in high schools, um, the topic of sex was narrowed to interactions between, cisgender men, cisgender women, and within heterosexual relationships. Within heterosexual relationships, religious views heavily shaped how they thought about heterosexual sex. It is heavily influenced by our puritanical roots, our Judeo-Christian values in the United States, and these values are all founded on the norm that sex is purely for procreative purposes and that the need for sexual pleasure is deviant. Now, sex negativity, which is sort of the polar opposite of sex positivity, is this view that sexual pleasure is deviant and immoral, and it's shaped how many of us view sex and conversations about sex, especially in schools. Because of heteronormativity, LGBTQIA plus issues in sex education is still a relatively new phenomenon. With conversations about sex, they're already silenced in schools, and thus queer issues would even be more forbidden in many schools and colleges throughout the country, both formally and informally. From a sex negative perspective, queer issues in sex education are even more deviant and immoral than typical conversations about sex. Hence, queer youth have had to access information about sex from alternative spaces outside of schools and colleges, outside of our classrooms. And this includes spaces such as the internet, social media, and even conversations with friends and peers. Now, this information can be supportive, it can be affirming. However, it may not be the most medically accurate or even sex positive information, or the most supportive information that supports a queer person's emotional and physical development. Now, what is sex negativity? Let's focus on the definition for a little bit. Sex negativity is the belief system that drives how our society views sex and how our schools teach about sex. It's this dominant view where sex is seen as inherently dirty, dangerous, and deviant, with heterosexual, procreative, and monogamous sexual interactions deemed as acceptable, especially deemed acceptable by those in power. So think about people within the box. And those people tend to lead our educational systems and other social institutions in our society. Sex negativity, that perspective excludes queer sexual identities, expressions, and sexual acts that fall outside of the strict heteronormative boundaries. Queer sex acts are seen as especially deviant. A sex negativity perspective is also patriarchal, in addition to heteronormative. That is, it's from the dominant perspective of those who fall within the box. That's white, cisgender, heterosexual, Christian, upper class, and cisgender male. Those who engage in sex for purposes outside of these heteronormative norms, outside of a heterosexual, procreative, monogamous relationship, are stigmatized by society. Now, that includes sex workers, that includes polyamorous folks and relationship structures, and members of the pansexual or even asexual communities, among other queer communities. In the next clip, I'd like you to watch this clip on your own using the Google Slides. And this is an example of sex negativity in our schools and how it intersects with patriarchy, especially how it impacts women. As you watch this clip, jot down a few notes about how sex negativity in a school system, in this particular context, adversely impacted this teacher's life. So pause right now, this video, and play this clip on your Google Slides. After watching that film, you may have noticed in your notes that sex negativity pervaded this example. Now, moving from sex negativity into sex positivity. So now that we've defined the dominant norm in our schools today, let's talk about an alternative norm, something that we can create, and a framework that's necessary for making all sex education queer inclusive. As inclusive educators and as educators interested in social justice and LGBTQIA plus support, we must move towards a framework of sex positivity. To be a sex positive individual and educator, this is a long-term and lifelong process where we must break down sex negativity in our daily lives and professional practice and work towards a more positive and caring relationship with sex. In defining sex positivity for yourself or for your professional practice as an educator, it's important to note first that sex is neither good nor bad. It is a subjective experience, and each of us has an individual relationship with sex. And this relationship with sex changes throughout the course of our lives. For instance, as we age, have different life experiences, and are in different places in life, or societies, or cultures, our view of sex also changes. And that can mean how much we view pleasure, how we view our particular intimate relationships, and even our sexual preferences. Now, even though our view and relationship with sex changes, that's neither good nor bad. We just know that the norm is that it changes. So why become sex positive? Why adopt this different perspective of, sex and relationships? Sex positivity has its benefits for inclusive and social justice oriented individuals and educators. It empowers us to stop questioning what we think is normal with regard to sex. The question is no longer asking, is this particular sex preference normal? Rather, we as individuals have the power to define that for ourselves within the parameters of consent and respect. And that's really, really important. When we think about sex positive frameworks of education and our own sex positivity, at the core of it is respect, consent, happiness, and pride in the diversity of sexual experiences. So, what is sex positivity in professional practice? How do we bring this knowledge into the world as educators? Well, in practice as educators, we must use clear, accurate language to describe sex with partners to our students. So oftentimes we use unclear, informal language to talk about sexual practices, but it's important to be very clear and to be very explicit with what we really mean so that students can really learn about sex positivity in practice. As sex positive educators, we must talk about and develop strategies for ethical communication in relationships. And these are ways in which we can develop respectful boundaries with potential partners and relationship structures, and also focus on the issue of consent. Sex positivity also means body positivity, that is recognizing the value and diversity of how our bodies look and how they feel and how they respond to sexual pleasure. And sex positivity also values difference and diversity of experiences in people. We all come from different backgrounds. We all come from different life experiences. So if you think about sex positivity and diversity, consent and respect above everything else are paramount. And when we put consent and respect at the core of our relationships, the core of our intimate relationships, that means sex can be anti-racist, anti-sexist, and overall anti-oppressive, because we're really respecting our partners. We've seen more examples of LGBTQIA plus inclusive education in schools today. However, as I said before, it's still very much a growing um, area of interest for educators. To make sex education more inclusive of LGBTQIA plus experiences, it's important to move beyond conversations about STI, that's sexually transmitted infections, and HIV prevention and safe sex practices. While those are really, really important to help young people stay healthy with regards to sex, physically healthy, there's more to sex than just prevention and safe sex practices. And that includes knowledge about our health and well-being, knowledge about our own relationship to sex and defining that, knowledge about what we consider to be loving relationships, healthy relationships, intimacy, pleasure, and consent. What does consent look like for everyone? Students also miss out on learning about the many ways that people express their sexuality, the diversity of experiences. And that includes learning about people who are on the asexual, aromantic spectrum, the pansexual community, the polyamorous community, and other queer identities and experiences that are prevalent in our world. Oh, before I go into the next slide, this is a very interesting short clip called The Case for LGBTQ Sex Positivity to sort of give you more of an introduction to how LGBTQIA plus identities can intersect with sex positivity. And I suggest that you watch this clip just for a moment. You could pause this, this recorded lecture and jot down a few notes about your initial insights and feelings. After watching that clip, I have another clip for you. And this is just, if you ever are searching through YouTube for educational videos that are queer inclusive and intersect with sex education, this is a wonderful, wonderful clip from a popular YouTube channel hosted by Eliza Hansen, which focuses on queer education for young adults or young children. I suggest you watch this clip to get a sense of how we communicate these types of issues to a very young audience. And I want you to think about the idea while you're watching this clip, the idea that it is possible to talk about these issues with young ones. And this debunks sort of that prevailing belief among many educators that a lot of these topics shouldn't be discussed in front of young ones. It is still possible, and there's lots of innovation at the moment with regards to this.